Okay, well, let's begin. Welcome to this press conference to present the report of the fact-finding panel into the detention of former Crown Prince Mohammed bin Nayef and Prince Ahmed Abdulaziz Al Saud, who are now referred to as Prince Ahmed. The panel was commissioned by a party interested in human rights and the welfare of detainees in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and they instructed Bindmans to convene the panel, and they invited me to chair it, and I invited the two parliamentarians to join us, Layla Moran, the Foreign Affairs spokesman for the Liberal Democrats, and Imran Ahmed Khan, the Conservative MP for Wakefield, has also served in a previous capacity with the Foreign Office. The mandate of the panel was to investigate and report on the detention of the two princes. It was to determine the location and nature of their detention and the conditions of that detention, to determine whether the detainees have been afforded adequate access to medical treatment whilst in detention, establish if the conditions in which the detainees are being detained are compliant with provisions under Saudi Arabian and international law, and to prepare a report on the findings. In September, I wrote to the Saudi ambassador in the United Kingdom requesting assistance with the facilitation of a visit to the detainees in Saudi Arabia. I'm grateful to the ambassador for his informal engagement with both me and the parliamentary members of the panel. But we've not been able to report any of that because they were off-the-record conversations in the style that one might expect ambassadors to the United Kingdom to have with parliamentarians. But we were not able to report those conversations in our report. The Prince's arrests must be viewed in the context of the numerous arrests and detentions of other political activists detained in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. They include dissidents, former government officials, journalists, academics, and members of the royal family. The report provides an analysis of three particularly high-profile cases that provide insight into how Saudi authorities are alleged to have targeted and treated certain perceived political opponents both inside and outside of the country. Jamal Khashoggi, Saeed Al-Jabri, and Saudi royals, Prince Salman bin Abdulaziz bin Salman Al Saud and Abdulaziz bin Salma bin Mohammed Al Saud. We are disappointed that we have not had greater cooperation from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and this is reflected in the conclusions of our report, which I will return to when I summarize. What I'd like to do now is to turn to my colleague, Layla Moran, to summarize the evidence relating to the princes and their detention. Layla.
Thank you very much, Crispin. So what I'm going to do is look specifically at, well, first of all, who are we talking about, but specifically looking at the circumstances of their both arrest and arbitrary detention. So the first person is former Crown Prince Mohammed bin Nayef, who we'll refer to as MBN. He was the Crown Prince of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Deputy Prime Minister between April 2015 and June 2017. He was also Minister of the Interior between November 2012 and June 2017. He's previously served as Assistant and Deputy Minister of Interior, and he's the cousin of the current Crown Prince MBS. We are also talking about Prince Ahmed Abdulaziz Al Saud, who we'll refer to as Prince Ahmed, and he is the younger brother of King Salman, one of the most senior members of the ruling family, 78. And both princes were arrested and detained in March 2020 together at a retreat in the desert, along with NBN's brother. There was damage to their vehicles, suggesting that they were forcibly detained, and their vehicles were extensively searched. Simultaneously, there were a number of NBN's household and business staff members who were arrested and held also at undisclosed locations. So one of the things that's really concerned us as a panel is the fact that they are being held in unofficial places of detention. Evidence received by the panel relating to the Ritz-Carlton arrests and indeed the arrests and detention of women rights defenders suggests that actually this is quite commonplace as a practice in Saudi Arabia, but we are concerned that therefore there is no oversight of their conditions in which the detainees are being kept, and no mechanism by which to hold accountable those responsible for the detention. We have received evidence that says that NBN has been detained without any explanation for the grounds of his arrest. Very concerning is also that he has not been able to speak to his lawyers about this case at all. And so he has not had proper representation to guide him through this particular situation. And there has been no review or independence of an impartial judge to determine whether or not the arrest was just or not. And what concerns us primarily is that it's not just about these two princes, and you could argue that there's a good chance they're being held in not squalid situations, but that is entirely irrelevant because what we're seeing here is a systemic problem in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has said in one of their opinions that in the 29-year history of the working group, they have found Saudi Arabia to be in violation of its international human rights obligations in at least 60 cases. So we are now making the point that this isn't just something that they're doing to quiet corners of their kingdom. They're using this arbitrary detention mechanism at all levels. The panel, of course, and I should say this very strongly, we have sought evidence from the kingdom for the reasons for the prince's detention and arrest, and nothing has been forthcoming, nothing has been received. And to echo Crispin's point, that is very disappointing indeed. Reports online allege that the princes were conspiring to block the ascent of MBS to the Saudi throne, and the evidence that we've received is that those allegations are denied. NGOs suggest that this was yet another move by MBS to consolidate his power by cracking down on any perceived opposition, and itself is concerning as a modus operandi, one that we hope that the kingdom will look to change in the near future. Thank you, Crispin.
Leila, thank you very much indeed. Now I'd like to turn to Imran Ahmed Khan to address the allegations of torture, incognito detention, and access to medical care during the detainees' detention. Imran.
Thank you. Further to the very concerning picture that we've been forced to be drawn from the evidence we've received that Leila touched upon, it's very concerning that Mohammed bin Nayef, the former Crown Prince, His Royal Highness was held in solitary confinement for over 6 months in an undisclosed location. An action that I think we would all agree amounts to torture and certainly cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment in contravention to the Mandela rules, which are the UN standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners. Now, perhaps some very small relief, although the concerns don't dissipate, is that His Royal Highness is no longer in solitary confinement, but we understand the threat of a return to solitary confinement is maintained should he not release funds to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And these funds are the subject of several diffuse allegations of corruption, but in a pattern that we see in other parts of the world, no evidence or formal charge regarding these allegations has been forthcoming. Of particularly grave concern to us on the panel is that this threat represents yet further mounting evidence of a pattern of behavior which are characterized by tactics such as extortion and coercion in return for the release, or in this case, inhuman treatment of those detained by authorities in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. We further have had to look at numerous credible reports of torture suffered by political activists. These have been heard by us on the panel. Among these allegations are that detainees have been blindfolded, stripped naked, humiliated, sexually and physically assaulted in the most disturbing ways, whipped, waterboarded, and more beastly behaviors they've been subjected to. So these detention conditions themselves that have been suffered by many, but including even the princes, we have not been able to be witness to them or view them, sadly, because despite repeated requests to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and to authorities, the Kingdom has failed to facilitate our visit to the Kingdom or to see the conditions in which these people are being housed, or to visit the detainees, which in itself is very concerning, and it adds to the concerns of international and other human rights organizations in terms of the conditions that are generally extant amongst Saudi Arabia's detention centers in terms of overcrowding and so on. The present situation in this COVID-ravaged year seems to have been exacerbated, and the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact and effect upon detainees held at the whim of the Saudi state is of great concern to us. Now, in regards to the former Crown Prince, we have several very concerning pieces of information that suggest that his health has drastically deteriorated since his detention. He's evidently lost a very significant amount of weight. The cause of this we are not certain of since 2020. He evidently appears pale and frail. He's suffering from significant pain in his joints and particularly knees that makes walking unaided exceptionally challenging for him. There appears to be, we are told, evidence of significant damage to his feet, which is of great concern. Again, as the cause of this damage to his feet is not certified, and we have not been able to see the prince or have any medical reports as to the cause of the damage to his feet. But of course, with a diabetic, foot damage is particularly concerning and can lead to very serious problems. So all in all, it's been a very concerning picture that we have been forced to draw from the evidence and the reports that we have been witness to. Crispin.
Imran, many thanks indeed. And I'm particularly grateful that my two colleagues agreed to serve on this panel. They bring their own distinction, their own contribution to foreign affairs. This is the third of these panels that I have chaired over the last 2 or 3 years, previously looking at the detention of Mohammed Morsi, and then at the beginning of 2019, we looked at the detention of the Saudi women detainees. But Imran and Layla bring their own authority and perspective to the work that we've done. But however, we are but, in that sense, politicians, whatever our experience. And many of the issues that we are engaged with are those of law and international law and humanitarian law. And we have been extremely well served by Tim Maloney QC and Heidi Digstal from Bindmans, who have advised the panel. Regrettably, Tim Maloney is appearing in a court of appeal today, so I'm afraid he can't join us at this press conference. But I'm absolutely delighted that Heidi Dikstal is able to join us. Heidi, I'd be very grateful if you could summarize the key legal points of the panel's findings.
Thank you. The fact-finding panel examined evidence received of human rights violations in light of Saudi Arabia's obligations under international human rights law. This includes within the Convention Against Torture, the Arab Charter on Human Rights, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and also within the guidance of the Mandela Rules and the Bangkok Rules, which were mentioned before. The panel considered the specific rights guaranteed within each of these documents, which were affected by the evidence that was received to the panel. The rights affected included guarantees about the international standards for detention. This included guidance for ensuring the health and well-being of individuals in detention through adequate conditions of detention. It also included limits to the use of solitary confinement and incommunicado detention, which UN experts have found can amount to psychological torture. The right to healthcare in detention was considered, which makes clear that healthcare for prisoners is the state's responsibility and must be administered at the same standard received by all citizens. The panel also examined Saudi Arabia's obligations to afford fair trial and due process rights to all those arrested and detained, including to be informed of the reasons for arrest and detention, and to have legal representation upon arrest and during interrogations and legal proceedings. Last, the panel considered the undergirdable right against physical and psychological torture and other abusive treatment. As noted by the panel members, evidence was received to the panel which tends to suggest violations of these rights in regards to political prisoners were committed. As such, the panel's recommendations aimed at ensuring that political prisoners are urgently afforded these rights, which have been denied, and encourage Saudi Arabia to sign on to and uphold all basic human rights, norms, and instruments. With the issuance of the report, some of the next steps that could be taken include presenting the report to governments. I should mention that, first of all, it's hoped that the findings and recommendations will genuinely be considered and adopted by the government of Saudi Arabia, but the report could be used in other forums as well. So it could be presented to other governments to increase pressure on Saudi Arabia to address concerns over its commitment to human rights. And the report could also be submitted for consideration by the UN General Assembly or the UN Human Rights Council. I think it's important to consider the UK's Magnitsky legislation, which recently sanctioned 47 individuals who were involved in human rights violations, including 20 Saudi nationals involved in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And this could be considered by providing the report to the UK government for their consideration and designation of individuals. And last, another way that the report could be used going forward is with human rights complaints to UN bodies. And this could include submitting it for the UN Human Rights Council's Universal Periodic Review process, before the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention for specific cases to consider whether detention is deemed arbitrary, before special rapporteurs for their own reports to UN mechanisms, and also before the Committee Against Torture during their periodic review of state parties, including Saudi Arabia's compliance with the convention. And I'll end it with that and happy to take any questions.
Heidi, thank you very much indeed. And in summary, it's plain that the conditions of the detention of these two princes do not meet the proper standards in any satisfactory way at all. And that the conclusion one has to draw is that this is systemic and it is part of a pattern of behavior of Saudi Arabia towards its citizens, however exalted. And if a former crown prince can be treated in this way and deprived of his rights, what does that say about the wider condition of people who are seen to be in political opposition to the government in Saudi Arabia? Now, the recommendations that the panel have arrived at, you've heard some of the legal ones just now from Heidi about where accountability should sit. But of course, for the politicians on the panel, all with foreign affairs experience, and some of us having been in Parliament quite a long time, with a long record of supporting engagement with Saudi Arabia and wanting the great friendship between Saudi Arabia and the United Kingdom to be able to continue. The concern is a political one and a security one, that the conduct of Saudi Arabia's behavior towards its own citizens undermines the wider security of all its allies. All of this is laid out in the report, and there are recommendations aimed at other members of the international community, particularly the G7, about the measures they might want to consider to encourage, to nudge Saudi Arabia in the right direction, to enable it to retreat from the path on which it is on, a path which, in my view, could only lead to disaster. It would be a disaster for the government of Saudi Arabia, a disaster for the people of Saudi Arabia, and a disaster for all of Saudi Arabia's friends if the systemic behavior that we have found here is able to continue. So these recommendations are designed to be constructive and to give an opportunity for Saudi Arabia to and I've just been told my camera is off, so if you will forgive me with the, however, I hope, given the flow of the conclusions, you can read them all in the report. And now let's open to questions, and I will try and restore my camera.
You're back, Crispin. Oh no.
So there we are. Right. I hope I'm now restored. And let me invite questions, and if you put those in the chat for anyone here. The first one is from Emma Wells, and Emma's question is: I see the panel are calling the international community and governments to take steps. Is the report aimed at any government in particular? Is it being presented to the British government? The report will be presented to the British government. It will also be sent to the incoming Biden administration in the United States. And we would hope that all of those who are interested in Saudi Arabia and the conduct of policy in Saudi Arabia, the policy officials in the G7 countries will look at our recommendations and assess whether our recommendations are appropriate in order to help persuade this very important member of the international community to behave in a way to its citizens that can be properly defended under the law and under universal human rights, and enable Saudi Arabia to present a context for the challenges it faces. And it is the absence of the public diplomacy for Saudi Arabia that means that we see that her case is then going by the board. And we see that it is this management of the relations towards her own citizens, as it means it is sometimes, or now it seems, much more convenient for the government of Saudi Arabia to stay quiet rather than engage in the public diplomacy to explain the context of the positions it is in. There's a question from David Rose to the panel. Can you please name or provide more detail on the NGO that commissioned this report? No, I'm afraid we can't, for I think for reasons that will be more than obvious. They are people who are engaged in the interested in the issues of human rights in Saudi Arabia. But more than that, if you want to understand why I would decline to say. Are there any more questions to the panel? And I don't know whether my colleagues want to pick up on the questions we've been asked.
We've also had a question from David there about the evidence, but the same applies. For security reasons, it would be unwise for all sorts of reasons to be able to say, and we appreciate that this will be slightly frustrating, but the evidence is compelling and we are sure of its source.
Thank you, Leila. Any more questions to the panel? I think want to, sorry, let me just, how will the government further engage human rights organizations to add further pressure on the regime? Well, I'm afraid to say I don't speak for the British government. And this obviously is a panel of 3 parliamentarians, one of whom has been in the government, one of whom I hope will in future be part of a Conservative government, and one of whom is the foreign affairs spokesman for a party that was in government only 5 years ago. But that is a question that needs to be addressed to the government. And I hope that we have raised constructive recommendations on the back of the conclusions that we've drawn and the analysis that we've made that will help the government chart a policy towards Saudi Arabia, which is always a very difficult challenge about how to get the message across to Saudi Arabia and to get the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to act in its own interests and our interests as regards issues of wider international law, in particular in respect of international humanitarian law.
If I may come in on the back of that, Crispin,
Yes,
I think it's worth noting that as part of its Vision 2030 plan, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia itself, the third pillar of it, is to create a high-performing government that is effective, transparent, and accountable. And so I think it's worth us pointing out that what we are trying to do is very much in the spirit of what its own vision purports that the kingdom wants to do. But until such time as they meet not just their own obligations, but the obligations that they claim to have signed up to, at least in principle, by signing up to the Arab Charter, that they should be held accountable. And one of the suggestions that we've made is that the government should be seriously considering furthering Magnitsky sanctions at individuals who are involved in these specific cases, but also more widely in both the arbitrary detention and torture regimes that we've heard evidence from, not just in this panel, but in other panels and are well documented, both by the UN and NGOs.
We've got a question.
If I may just come on the back of that as well.
Emma, my apologies. So I'm looking at simply at the chat.
I think
can't see you in Wakefield.
I think, as Crispin mentioned, we're not in government, so we can't speak for government, and it's a very difficult position for the British government because, like all of us individually, the British government is a strong and firm friend of Saudi Arabia. But I think here there's actually a very important point about Britain and British interest and what we stand for as well, which actually goes to many of our G7 partners, in that Prince Mohammed bin Nayef was a great friend of this country, and he was an active, responsible world citizen. And I think that to actually take up this case and the case of around it of those detainees is important, because it will show people in Saudi Arabia, including the current government of Saudi Arabia, rulers of Saudi Arabia, that Britain is a steadfast friend and not just a fair weather friend, and that we will stand with you and support you and take care of your interests, whether the winds are fair or foul. And I think that's an important note to make, and it should actually strengthen our resolve to actually engage and support our friends in good times and bad.
Imran, thank you very much. The next question does address an extremely important issue, which is from Mina Habalo, which is inviting us to elaborate on how Saudi behavior is a threat to peace and stability. Of course, the answer to that goes towards the stability of the government itself. And if you are a consultative monarchy and you close down the political space by the kind of behavior that is elaborated in this report to those people closest to you who have been senior members of the government, but as well as the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi and the apparent attempts on the life of other Saudi opponents of the government in exile, as well as the behavior towards political dissidents in Saudi Arabia altogether. That message will be received loud and clear by the people of Saudi Arabia. And if, as has happened, you turn on your own family and you close down the space for your people to be able to speak, one, you will not be able to deliver the economic and reforms, as Imran has just referred to, and as Layla pointed out, the transparency required of a society to be able to draw on the best of the talents of all of its people to contribute the ideas into delivering 2030. This cannot be done by diktat from the center on its own. And so the economic agenda that Saudi Arabia has set itself will then find it much more difficult to happen. But then the government itself will find itself isolated from its people. And the further it goes down the path of illegal and bloody repression, the more difficult and the more dangerous the situation will become for that government. It has to find a way to have the support of its people and the contribution of its people to the great future that Saudi Arabia ought to have. I don't know whether Layla and Imran wish to add to that. If not, let me then go to David Rose's question about the allegations against the princes and the use of social media to smear them, in particular Mohammed bin Nayef. We're not dealing with the allegations against the princes. We're dealing with the conditions of their detention and whether or not due process is being followed. And our conclusion is that it has not. If there is a proper case against anyone in any country, then it needs to be conducted under the law, and both domestic and international law standards. So a country like Saudi Arabia can hold its head up high and explain why people have been brought to justice in a proper way and have had the chance to make their case against the allegations made. That is not the purpose of this panel. However, David, you have very properly pointed to the concern about the use of social media, and hence the recommendation in the report that where it's seen that governments are operating against their own citizens by the use of social media, then we are inviting then the G7 governments to come to the appropriate conclusions and the appropriate actions, make clear that that behaviour is wholly unacceptable.
If I may just elaborate slightly on what you've said there, Crispin. I mean, when we've had evidence submitted, and I'm quoting from the report now, it's as Crispin rightly says, it is not for us to make a judgment as to whether or not the allegations are true or untrue. However, it's also worth pointing out that MBN has not had an explanation for the grounds of his arrest. He's not been able to contest his detention, and quoting from the report, he's also not been able to have access to an independent and impartial judge. He's had no access to a lawyer to discuss his situation, and his case has not been reviewed to determine whether or not it is appropriate to continue his detention. And that is notwithstanding and quite apart from the evidence we've received about his treatment while in detention. And I suppose the point we make here is that this is how they are treating a former crown prince. And if they are doing that to him, and indeed Prince Ahmed, then what are they doing to others? And we're drawing those links between the two. I think David also asked us to comment on the relationship to the Biden administration. I mean, at this point, David, it would only be conjecture. It certainly wasn't something we looked at specifically in the report. We do point out that, of course, MBN had links and trained in the FBI. We know that for a long time, as Imran said, he's well regarded by the West generally. And Biden, in his presidential campaign, made references to having a stronger approach to Saudi Arabia than perhaps the Trump administration did before. Anything beyond that is frankly conjecture. We'll have to wait and see how this works. But to the motivations for why they might have done this, again, we can only go by what NGOs who are closer to the ground than us have presented to us. But this does seem to be part of a pattern of behavior where MBS cracks down on those who oppose him or threaten him. We saw that this has backfired on the international scene in the last few years. And the case that we made when we met the ambassador, and indeed in this report, is that this is a time where the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia could use reports like this, in the response to reports like this, as an opportunity to show that they are changing course and changing direction if they're serious about changing how they are viewed on the world stage.
Leila, thank you very much indeed. If there are no more questions, I'm intending, subject to any comments Imran might wish to make, to conclude our proceedings there. Thank you very much for all of those who have attended. My profound thanks again to my colleagues on the panel for their work, and in particular to the lawyers who have supported us and the administrators. I'm extremely grateful for the work and the proud of the quality of the report that we have produced, which I hope will be quietly paid attention to in the capitals where it needs action on its recommendations. Thank you all very much indeed.